This is Democracy,
a podcast that explores the interracial, intergenerational, and intersectional
unheard voices living in the world's
most influential democracy.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we're going to discuss an issue that's in the news, but also an issue with deep historical roots, the transitions of societies that have been part of the Soviet Union to democracy, or the difficulties they've had in those transitions. And we're going to focus in particular today on Ukraine, which in some ways is one of the largest and most important of the former Soviet states, and a society that's gone through a lot of tumult in recent years, and most recently has just held the first round of a new presidential election. And we will be talking today about how we understand changes and difficulties in Ukraine and what that means for us as we think about democratic transitions around the world. We're very fortunate to have with us three students who are conducting one of the most important research projects that I know of on this topic. They're spending a great deal of time with Ukrainian students and young voters trying to understand how they understand democracy and how they think about the future of their society and what we can expect from them as we hope soon they become the leaders of their society. These three students are all stars here at UT, and we're fortunate to have them here. We have Maya Patel. Good morning, Maya.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure. Matt Maldonado.
Good morning.
Morning, Matt. Here. And we have Lauren Nyquist.
Good morning.
So we have our all-star team. And before we get to our all-star team, we have our all-star poet. Zachary, what's the title of your poem?
Song of a Post-Cold War Child.
Well, let's hear it, Post-Cold War Child.
I have heard how they stormed through the streets. I have heard how they rocked the sleep of thousands. I have heard how they killed my ancestors in millions of deaths. I have heard how they dripped blood in the alleyways. I have heard how you couldn't hear the music you wanted to dance, to prance to under the cold skies. And I have heard you couldn't speak through the telephone of anything but the quality of the dreadfully whipping weather. And I have heard how you couldn't vote, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I have heard how the snow used to fall in the moldy corners, but I have never seen the flurries. I am too young to have seen those snowdrifts, those dispatches from forever. I am too young to have seen the lies, the shoes stomped against the desk of the world. And I am too young to have seen the rotting bodies, the fake votes tallied against the blood. And I am too young to have seen the reforming sun, the hope in the forests of weapon silos. And I am too young to have seen the wall fall, the newborn adults streaming across the rubble, streaming across in their nylon plastic cars. But I will not be too old to see the day the votes are counted in the light of democracy. I will not be too old to see the day when the music plays through every window. I will not be too old to see the free talk, the hopeful hums, the opening of the world. And I will not be too old to see the day when I can walk through the rubble of the nuclear silos blown to the sun, never to be used, bombs buried into the earth. And I promise you I will not be too old to see the day that I can sing with my Russian neighbors as they sing my American song, and I can sing their own.
Wow. Very historical, Zachary. What's your poem about?
My poem is really about just being born in a society that was shaped by the Cold War, but never actually experiencing it, and how that gives me a unique perspective on some of these issues.
That's a really good point to start on. Maya, why has it been so hard for Ukraine and countries like Ukraine to transition from the Cold War to a post-Cold War, post-Soviet world?
Yeah, I think in part it's because there still is so much influence on the region and, both sides, the Western side and Russia trying to influence the country and how it goes and their elections and, who leads the country. They have a unique perspective because when talking to some of these students, some of them truly don't feel like there are free and fair elections. Interesting.
Matt, do you find the students who you talk to, as they're thinking about these transitions, are they cynical, or what are your views of them?
So in our experience running these focus groups with Ukrainian students, I think cynicism is one of the big overarching themes that we've seen. And I don't think it's tied to any kind of regional variation. We've spoken to students in the east, in cities like Kharkiv, or in the west, like cities like Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk. And I think overall there's this general kind of cynicism that all the candidates that are running are corrupt and that their vote doesn't matter. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case with the young generation, which we in the West hope to be the generation that really brings Ukraine into the modern world.
Right. So you don't see them as idealistic.
I don't really. It hasn't been all that positive, I'd say.
Lauren, your team has interviewed so many of these counterparts of yours there. Beyond this cynicism and concern about leadership, what else strikes you about them?
I think it's just a lack of direction in which to turn. And I think that's perfectly articulated in what we are seeing out of Ukraine this Sunday. I don't think any of us are particularly surprised because of what we've heard from these students, is, as my counterparts have said, they're so disenfranchised because they're, like Zachary was saying earlier, is they weren't there necessarily during the during Soviet rule. However, they are the product of the trauma from that time period. And so we don't necessarily hear them drawing lines of connection between that time period and today, but we see the impact of it. It's kind of like trauma and how trauma is magnified generationally down the line. And so we're seeing kind of Zelensky as, I don't think, as Matt said earlier, I don't think we see any ideal kind of outcome from them, but I think they see Zelensky as kind of a protest vote from the establishment.
And Zelensky is the media star, the comedian in Ukraine, who plays a president on television and is now run for president and had the most votes in the first round, right? Yeah. That didn't surprise you? I
don't think it did, because I think that we see a perfect dichotomy between an establishment, Poroshenko, who is at the most the establishment. He is the current president. He is tied to all of the different kind of established areas of Ukraine. And then we see Zelensky, who actually came out of nowhere in the last 6 months.
Right.
So that's just that perfect dichotomy, which allows us to kind of see that anti-establishment.
Gotcha. And Matt, is your sense that voters for Zelensky see him as a positive alternative, or is he more of a none of the above kind of candidate?
I think he's more of a none of the above kind of candidate. And in some of our readings that we've done in connection to this election, we looked at the 2010 election where Viktor Yanukovych took the presidency, and people were drawing some connections between that situation and this situation.
Interesting.
People viewed Yanukovych as a protest vote against the establishment. At that time was Viktor Yushchenko. And in this situation, I think a vote for Zelensky is being taken quite literally by voters as a vote against the establishment.
Interesting. Is there a communist candidate? Is there still a communist party? I mean, one of the legacies of the Cold War is, of course, how communism continues through other means in certain societies. Maya, is there a communist party?
I would jump in and just say that, so it's hard to distinguish if there's a particularly communist candidate. We were talking yesterday because someone in the survey results, we were piecing through all of our survey results. And someone said they were a national
Someone
socialist.
claimed to be a national socialist.
Which is
Really?
it's actually illegal. So someone did say that it could have been. We always have to discount some of those outliers when getting survey results back. But there were 47 candidates in this election from different political parties. Wow. So there are certain politicians who who do align more with the legacy of the Soviet Union more so than others. So it does exist, but it is technically illegal to be politically.
Yeah, there's no outright communist candidate, I would say, but there are 47 candidates, and it's hard to see what each one is trying to say.
Because one of the issues, of course, in many of these societies are the ways in which, first of all, former communist leaders hold on to power in other names, but also in ways in which certain communist assumptions about politics and political organization carry over. In fact, one of our students had a question directly related to this. This is from Austin Buffkin, and let's hear what Austin has to say.
How do you think that Ukrainian citizens' experience with communism helps change and refine their implementation of democracy? And do you think their experience with communism is beneficial or detrimental to the effectiveness of democracy in their country.
What do you guys think?
So I think when we talk about democracy in like a U.S. context, we have a very different definition than what maybe the Ukrainian students consider themselves. So, for example, one of our survey questions was, "Are you an active Ukrainian?" Which basically translates to like, "Are you like civically engaged? Are you like an active citizen, I guess?" And a lot of them said no, but then we asked, like, are you involved in non-formal political activities? So many more people said yes. And like in our definition, we would say like if you're civically engaged and involved in, or like if you're involved in all these non-formal political activities, you're an active U.S. citizen.
Sure.
So I think it's interesting to see how their definition of democracy is very different.
And what do you take from that? Why do they not consider their non-formal activities political?
Well, I think a lot of them are hesitant to call themselves like political people, but they do care about politics in like a way that like here, if you like mildly care about politics, you're like, yeah, I'm like kind of interested, I vote. But they're, being seen as a political person is almost like a taboo, like a bad thing, and they don't want to call themselves that.
For a long time, there was scholarship about anti-politics. That in fact, the notion was if you were a serious person, you shouldn't be involved in politics because politics was corrupted by the communist influence. Do you see that playing out, Matt?
I do, because I think a lot of these students are fundamentally influenced by their parents who grew up under either Brezhnev or individuals like Andropov or Chernyenko. Right. So
these were all Soviet leaders in the 70s and 80s.
These were leaders that highlighted the stagnant period of Soviet history. Right. And as a result, I think growing up in these households with these parents, that mentality has kind of followed them into young adulthood.
Mm-hmm. Lauren, do you agree?
I do kind of want to, I guess, have a more positive outlook on it.
Good, please.
I do see a, I guess, move away from recognizing just a dichotomy between a kind of communist system and a democratic system, as was established kind of in the Cold War period, where we saw an either or. Right. And I think right now we're kind of seeing, I guess one of the articulated responses when we asked what political system is ideal was it hasn't been defined yet. It wasn't, I align necessarily with Russia or I align with the political system of the United States anymore. It was more, I want to move past these established systems and move towards something that is going to be inherently unique to Ukraine. And I think that may draw out of their experiences with communism. I wouldn't say that it hinders or necessarily helps. I think that they've just been disillusioned to both sides. And so they are, I guess we have a very specific kind of group. We're seeing very critical thinkers coming out of universities. Those are the students that we're interviewing. Our surveys are more wide kind of spread. I see. But they are critical thinkers, and they're looking beyond the established kind of paths that were, I guess, articulated in the Cold War.
And how do they view the United States and America's traditional diplomatic and democratizing mission?
One of our focus group interviews was with students in Odessa, and that particular sit down took place right after the end of the U.S. government shutdown. Okay. So there were definitely a lot of questions about Trump and his actions in regards to Congress. So I think the Trump presidency has kind of just opened up a lot of doors for, questioning about the U.S. political system. And so far, the students have been very curious about that. Interesting.
Other reactions you've heard from them?
I think it's been surprising to hear how many students were, like one of our first focus groups was with Ivano-Frankivsk students, and they were talking, like a lot of them supported the border wall and thought it was a good idea, and were like had a positive view of Trump, which I thought was really interesting. And yeah, it was kind of surprising to hear that. And I think, part of the reason why Zelensky won or has won the first round might be because they're very like, done with the system and want change. And I think that was like similar to what we like saw for reasons why people voted for Trump.
Interesting. What about their view of international organizations? Do they see themselves connected to a world of international organizations?
I think that was probably one of our largest questions that we kind of got responses on, was particularly about the EU. I think we either saw students who really wanted to be a part of the EU or saw the EU as a future goal. They don't see themselves as ready to join the EU or necessarily worthy. I think they're very critical of where their country is economically, politically, and socially. There was a statement that kind of caught me off guard because it said Ukrainians themselves aren't ready, which is definitely, when we associate political organizations, we don't necessarily look at a minute scale to that degree. But it was definitely an interesting question because they would look towards the EU as a pinnacle of economic success, or a stepping point to, right now we talked a lot about Brexit, as the EU could possibly foster a economic system of growth or anti-corruption initiatives or help with systems like that. And then they could later leave once they've established themselves as a strong country. But that was definitely and
that was as true for students in the West as in the East? Because traditionally the East has felt closer to Russia, right?
I don't think we saw anyone who particularly said we need to align ourselves with Russia. I think we did meet...
But there were a lot of students who were like, I don't think the EU is a good idea. We heard a lot of, like, we need to become strong on our own first before joining the EU. And then also, one girl was like, we're not in the right mindset. We aren't... It almost seemed like they weren't of, like, a high enough moral standard to join the EU, which I thought was an interesting comment. But there was a pretty wide range of, like, we should join or we shouldn't.
This is such valuable research for thinking not just about the historical evolution of Ukraine and other societies going through post-communist transitions, but also for thinking about U.S. policy, right? If our goal is and should be to build connections with the next generation of leaders in important countries like Ukraine, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, et cetera, we have to understand where they're coming from, right? And with that knowledge that you all have put together and that you're bringing out in your research, what do you think are the insights for thinking about American policy? What would you suggest that the United States do to connect with these students who are so important for their future and our future?
I think continuing these micro-level kind of education initiatives.
I mean, funding more research like your own.
Yeah. To establish, I guess so. Yeah. Because we're talking at a very personal level. And I don't think you can, especially if Ukraine chooses to go a different route and not necessarily democratic, I think that it's going to be important to have these connections so that we respect that. I think one of the biggest faults in kind of undermining our position abroad is that we often don't respect a move away from a democratic system. And if we can understand that some of our students really just want a leader who will make decisions to lead the country in the right direction and not necessarily listen to the citizens themselves. They want someone who will make strong economic moves and make anti-corruption moves outside of necessarily being held accountable.
And you don't think we should oppose that?
I think that we should not. I think at a greater level for foreign policy, I think that we often see ourselves as having to have the same political system as as countries abroad, because I think that creates a basis. But I think that what this project has shown me is that at this micro level, we can understand where their perspective is, and we have to be able to respect that, because if they're democratically electing in this election, and we haven't seen any reports of abuse by the political system necessarily yet, but we do have to respect that, and I think that this allows us to create this respect, which is kind of absent at this broader geopolitical level, because you don't have that connection.
Right, fair enough. Other thoughts on what we should do?
Yeah, if I could just chime in. I think one of the, policies that has made our work on this project so valuable has been programs like FLAS and Fulbright.
Foreign language and area studies and Fulbright student and faculty exchanges, right?
Yes. So I about half
you received a Fulbright, actually.
Yes, I received a Fulbright GPA grant. And a FLAS this year. I think, programs like that are important because it gives students, undergraduates, opportunities to make these exchanges on their own first, and then later on potentially get into some deeper research. And the faculty members who have been helping us have been outstanding, and they themselves have also received similar types of grants. So I think in order to continue making these types of connections with students down the line, we need to continue funding these kind of programs.
Good shout out for faculty. Well done, Matt. Zachary, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, how do these students view Russia? Do they view it as a threat or as something that can help them grow as a society?
I think so. We have two different things. So we do the focus group, which is where we talk to students. And if someone else wants to chime in on that, I'll chime in on the survey, which is a different kind of part of our research. And what we got from the survey is that Russia largely hinders the free and fair election and progress towards a democracy, like a democratic institution. And we kind of saw that dichotomy with that question particularly. We saw that institutions like the EU, NATO, and the United States are associated with helping, whereas Russia is associated with the war, Crimea, and hindering any free and fair election and democratic institution.
Yeah, and with the focus groups, I think we saw similar themes. Students weren't as ready to outwardly call out Russia over the focus groups, but I think you got that kind of vibe, I guess, from them. They weren't really willing to say it outright, but you could kind of see that they were trying to say that.
Sure. Well, and this connects to another student question we have on our side, which is really about how students like all of you can do more. How we can all get involved. Let's hear the question from Miranda Rodriguez.
How can college students in the United States become more educated about democracy in former Soviet countries, which we still see as so different from us?
And I think Miranda's question presumes that most students are not going to have the time to do the kind of in-country research you're doing, and in many cases won't be able to learn the languages, right? So how can they, as voters in the United States, who are going to be influencing U.S. policy here, how can they act our students more effectively to help students in these societies like Ukraine?
I think that when university professors have these classes about various countries, if there could be some sort of global classroom, even if it's just one or two class Skype sessions with students or young people,
actually bringing them into the class.
Yeah, so you don't need to dedicate a whole semester to calling 3 times a week to the country, but I think even just a few calls, even just from the first time we ever talked to Ukrainian students over Skype, I learned so much from just an hour. So I think that's one way that students.
That's
can
a great
get involved.
suggestion. My other thoughts?
I think social media has allowed us so many, just another way for us to connect with students abroad. So getting involved on something like VK allows us to...
What is VK?
It's a Russian social media, platform.
It's the first time on our podcast anyone has advocated VK, but okay.
Well,
or Telegram.
Okay, yeah, if we want to go to Telegram. But VK, because Matt and I were in Russia last summer, and so VK is kind of how we connect with them and see the cultural initiatives. I think going behind just the blanket political system and seeing that there are people, but I think it needs to happen in the United States at kind of a broader education level. Our education initiatives, especially for high school and middle school when we teach history, portray these countries in a very negative light. And I think that's if we need to vote in our state board, or our state board elections, we need to vote in our local education elections to kind of change that, because I think by the time we get into college, we've got these perceptions about these countries that are so deep seated within us that it becomes automatic to associate these countries with a particular level of development, with a negative connotation of governance, and that's the product of our education system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's another great suggestion, Lynn. Matt, what do you think?
I think students just need to stay vigilant with their current events, and maybe even go back a couple of years. I think it's important to realize that, not all former Soviet states have been directly in the Russian sphere since 1991. I think it's important to remember that Russia fought a war with Georgia in 2008, or that, people still forget that Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. So I think just staying with their ears close to the ground is going to be helpful in regards to current events, because these issues are ongoing and they will continue to be. Right. So an informed citizen is a good citizen.
Right, and we have to also ask our news coverage to provide information. It's interesting how little of the Ukrainian election was covered. Maya?
Yeah, I was just about to say, to build off of what Matt was saying, and not just making sure that we're reading our Western sources, but making sure that we're reading the sources of news that are local to whatever region you're studying, because there's a certain way that, these different news stories are covered in the U.S. or in more Western Europe, and I think it's important to also be reading local news sources and looking at the influencers that are on the ground, and looking at all perspectives.
Right, absolutely, really getting a deeper sense of what's happening there. Zachary, do you think young people today are interested in these issues and will follow them?
I do think so, but I think as Lauren was saying, it's very ideologically focused, that these countries have so much corruption and are still in the Russian sphere, when really we don't understand them as independent, sort of very vibrant countries. And I think that with better education and a more broad, unbiased look at the world, that can only help as we move forward.
Right. Well, I am super optimistic after our discussion here, because I think what we see with Maya, Matt, and Lauren, and Zachary, and what we're hearing about students in Ukraine is that there's a lot of confusion and even a lot of cynicism. But there's also, it seems, a commitment to try to understand. And cynicism can turn to idealism when it's focused on getting beyond propaganda or beyond ignorance to actually understand the ways in which societies change. And as I think Lauren said so well, when it's also about trying to show the respect of trying to understand the people behind the words. And I'm so proud that all of you are doing that. And I think there's more and more of an interest in that. Maybe distrusting party lines and headlines is a good thing for our societies. And maybe that's a reason why more podcasts are helpful. Thank you for joining us today for this fascinating episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harrison Lemke, and you can find his music at harrisonlemke.com.
Subscribe and stay tuned for a new episode every Thursday featuring new perspectives on democracy.